With Jujutsu Kaisen chapter 255, it picks up where the last one left off, and right away we start getting answers as to why Miguel was sought out for the sole reason of helping bring down Sukuna, and what the narrator meant in the last chapter about Miguel being the one person who could go toe-to-toe with Gojo in exchange of fists, as well as getting a return of some familiar characters to the cast itself. We all immediately thought back to Gojo making Miguel a punching bag in Jujutsu Kaisen Zero's movie, but instead we learned that there's more to him, and that the upscaling for Miguel, it isn't lazy writing like some of the comparisons that you might have gotten with Hakuri and Yuta talking about how Gojo's punches feel like they're counter punches and that they hit you so hard that you begin to start vomiting. We actually see the answer from Gojo's perspective on what the narrator meant, which that in of itself makes the returns of the other characters in the story hit that much harder, because now you can start scaling people. So we open up with Sukuna being peeved that Miguel and LaRue have managed to save Ui Ui, and they're shown holding on to the remains of Kusakabe as they stare down Sukuna, and that's where the story transitions us into not just a flashback, but Gege takes the time to say, I'll see you flashback and I'll raise you another flashback, like this is a old school Naruto chapter. In the first flashback that we get, Miguel is approached by Okotsu about helping them take down Sukuna, and Miguel lets it be known right away that he's not keen on signing up for what is essentially a suicide mission. That beatdown that Gojo gave him, it was clearly still in his mind, and he makes a point to say that fighting against someone who would be strong enough that they could take down Gojo, that's an adventure he wants no parts of, and the man can't be blamed when he says this. That's like asking someone who survived a fight against Prime Mike Tyson and lost in the ring, and then has to go through and fight Prime Muhammad Ali right after they beat Prime Mike Tyson, someone who you yourself couldn't even beat, even if that's supposed to be a handicap, because Muhammad Ali would be worn down. You still have to pause for a moment, because anyone who could beat someone that you couldn't beat probably has more nasty things up their sleeve that you can't handle. So Miguel's apprehension and initial refusal, it makes complete sense here, especially when you get to the end of the chapter itself. However, the effort to win over Miguel to fighting against Sukuna, it continues on in the story, with Miguel being told, hey, the difference is that Sukuna would be super worn down by fighting someone as strong as Gojo. We're not asking you to fight him fresh. We're not even asking you to be the one who kills him, so much as you continue to jump in on him after he's worn down to help us kill him, which you can be a part of doing. And Yuta tries to appeal to Miguel from a different perspective, saying, hey, if this merger with Master Tengen takes place, it's going to affect more than just Japan, but it's also going to affect your country in Africa. And this man Miguel basically says, I don't care if it's Godzilla as a cursed spirit that's pulling up and he's coming to Africa. I'll take fighting that thing over fighting against Sukuna, which if you're Sukuna somewhere, you're probably smiling if someone tells you what happened here, because of the praise that you're getting as well as the respect. All these Japanese sorcerers are talking like they got a chance against Sukuna, and it's the black guy who says, hey, wait a second, this don't make no sense, and I'd rather fight against Godzilla than to go against a jujutsu sorcerer like Sukuna. Now, I do find this interesting with how much the merger has been getting alluded to. If you're gay, you almost have to find a way to pull a trigger on this thing. It'll be the biggest case of blue balls if you ever continue to start mentioning how terrible this thing's going to be, and then you tell us how it isn't just going to stop at Japan's borders, it's going to reach all the way to Africa, and then we never see it take place. That's gotta be endgame in my opinion. This has got to be something we see. He even goes as far as to say, look man, just because I'm black doesn't mean I'm going to survive this thing, which means that Miguel clearly got the memo that this battle is taking place before Black History Month, where there's a mandatory 100% increase of all stats of black characters and the plot armor automatically doubles. But jokes aside though, I did like the line that's thrown in there that the only people who think about black people in that manner are people overseas who watch those cheesy 80 American films. And that just goes to show you about the power of media and what it can do in shaping the perspective that other people have of you, for better or for worse. Miguel basically continues pushing back, saying that if this was such a big deal, then why isn't Gojo here begging him for help? And he's asking the question he already knows the answer to, which is that Gojo in character would never in a scenario like this be asking him for help, and that essentially after we get these hilarious scenes of Miguel freaking out over Yuta being weird, we get down to business a little more, and we once again get to a point where we start stepping into some controversial territory. So you have Miguel and LaRue, and they're speaking about what happened in Shinjuku, basically the events of the Jujutsu Kaisen Zero movie, and Miguel says he paid his dues to Japan and that the Japanese people are basically paid back for his involvement in Shinjuku. When the heartstring attempts to get pulled by mentioning the lives of their comrades who died, Miguel, he fires back and says, are you saying that we should start taking revenge because our comrades got killed by Sukuna and got betrayed by Kenjaku in Shibuya? Are you saying that we should be trying to get Geto's body away from Kenjaku? And when the prospect of heaven and hell gets brought up, Miguel doesn't hold his tongue, and he pretty much lets it be known that he expects Geto to be in hell, which that's like, wow. That's where we learn that Miguel has a few conditions for getting involved in any type of fight with Sukuna, and it explains the order at which we've seen people show up to fight against Sukuna. Miguel says he doesn't want to fight Sukuna until Gojo and Yuta have both fought Sukuna and wore him down to a point this domain is useless, and he demands that he doesn't fight Sukuna alone. This transitions us back to the fight, and we see Miguel and LaRue, and they're licking their chomps at the situation that's given to them. Sukuna appears to be worn down. His reverse curse technique is weakened, and he's missing his limbs. Most importantly of all, his heart still hasn't been healed by Maki's attack, so they know if they're going to take down Sukuna, this has to be the time at which they strike, and the battle quickly jumps off. First, Sukuna gets restrained and pushed back against the wall when Miguel tries to jump into the fray. Sukuna attempts to search counter, and we see them putting pressure on Sukuna, all while the narrator breaks down the curse techniques of LaRue and Miguel. LaRue's curse technique allows him to grip the target, and even if the illusion of the hand is destroyed, it can be instilled an indefinite amount of times, and only 1/10 of the damage gets inflicted and transferred back to LaRue's body, which makes it a pretty nifty hacks, unless you're fighting someone like Sukuna, who isn't impressed by this at all. But instead, the one whose curse technique that gets his attention is Miguel, whose Hakuna Lana uses a rhythmic beat etched into his body to enhance his physical stats and also debuff cursed spirits. It gets described to us in another flashback as shooting off a stat buff and a debuff without having to utilize the domain. So you can kind of think of this like this might be his own version of a simple domain without actually using simple domain. Now, for a bit of interesting information here, when you dive into the meaning behind the curse technique being used, you come into a deeper appreciation. Hakuna Lana comes from the Swahili language, which is translated into without curses, and is in reference to the Song of Grace. It's a ritual done by Maasai warriors, a group of young warriors who use grace and speed and leaping ability when they're hunting and fighting. That's a nice bit of tidbit to file away as you pay attention to how Miguel's fighting Sukuna here, as well as how he fought against Gojo in the Jujutsu Kaisen movie. It explains a lot, really. Now, during the next flashback we get, Gojo basically reveals that he already knew how Miguel's curse technique operated, and when he says that sorcerers are mostly Japanese, 99%, but guys like Miguel who have curse energy buff added to their technique makes them more menacing, we get a hilarious line of Miguel saying, hey, what you're saying is racist. And interestingly enough, that is something that it goes back decades what's being said here, that there's this belief that just because someone's black, they have a higher pain tolerance and threshold, and they were naturally suited for certain types of tasks. However, what's interesting here though is that there's actually quite a few studies that say that black people had the highest ethnicity rated for muscle mass, with blacks at 22, Asians at 19, whites at 21, Hispanics at 20, and the ethnic groups, they tended to gain muscle mass at faster rates as was listed. So it went from blacks to whites to Hispanics, then to Asians. So what Gojo's saying here, you could argue there is some statistical merit to what he's saying about Miguel's body, but the wording that Miguel used in the chapter, from saying that because he's black doesn't mean he can survive this, to Gojo's mentioned above about muscle mass and Miguel saying how racist that is, it's almost like it's both sides of the same coin. It's then that we learn why Gojo holds Miguel in such high regard. And when you're getting praise from someone like Gojo, that's very high praise. He says that if they were to be fighting using only curse energy enhancement with no technique, then Gojo said he'd win the marathon. But of course, he's gonna say that he's Gojo. But what's interesting here is that he says that if they were talking short term, with short term being a sprint, then Miguel will be the winner. Basically saying that the longer a fight goes under those conditions, it will benefit Gojo, but the shorter it goes under those conditions, it would benefit Miguel. As we see Miguel, he's doing pretty impressively against Sukuna, and we see Choso attempting to snipe out Sukuna from a distance, and Itadori comes down with a double hammer cross, attempting to bash Sukuna's head in from the top, but Sukuna manages to block the attack, and it comes to a shock to Sukuna, who wasn't expecting Itadori to still be hanging in there. Shows us that whenever Sukuna's got a chance to dump on Itadori, he's going to take it. And we see the narrator drop off more very important knowledge to us. In order to use Dismantle, he needs to use the same hand seal for Malevolent Shrine, but with only one arm left, Sukuna was forced to use a Binding Vow to use the move to cut down Gojo, which explains why Gojo had that shocked look on his face when he was getting cut down, because he didn't see that one coming into the end, and it's because it was a Binding Vow. Most importantly, we get an answer as to how Sukuna was able to kill Gojo under those circumstances, but people like Maki were able to avoid Sukuna slashes. People like Kusakabe were able to sense them coming. You can chalk it up to another example of ongoing manga requires more patience to learn about how a plot twist happens, because the answers aren't going to be revealed to you in the first chapter or even the first 4 or 5 chapters after something happens. Whereas when all this stuff is animated, this is probably gonna be like 5 episodes of the anime. Manga requires a little bit more patience. With Sukuna in the position he's in, the walls they appear to be closing in, and dealing with 4 sorcerers, if that wasn't enough, Sukuna realizes that Maki, she's still around and she doesn't look damaged against Sukuna, and it looks like she managed to use her weapon to block some of the attack of the Black Flash. This leads to Itadori getting super excited because they finally have a chance to bring down Sukuna, and it's important to note that with each hit Sukuna gets hit by with Itadori, Yuji is slowly waking Megami up. But here's the thing, Yuji, he isn't wrong that they still have a shot. Sukuna's lost 2 left hands. He can't use World Cutter Dismantle anymore, so you gotta be thinking they got a shot right now. However, this is a clear example of you don't count your chickens before they hatch, because Sukuna wasn't fighting Gojo blindly. He was also paying attention to his movements, and he ended up using one of the moves that Gojo used on him, which is Gojo was able to use Black Flash twice in a fight to restore his lost reverse curse technique, which Jesus, just when it seems like Yuji and company have turned a corner and managed to push him against the wall, Sukuna somehow manages to break down the wall behind him to give himself more space, because Sukuna has now been recharged.